Okay, so welcome to today's meetup. So today we have a talk about estimation, which is a challenge for a lot of complex and large system, often resulting in poor forecast and missed milestones. With Agile's just-in-time refinement and estimation, how can we estimate early and with confidence to improve our forecasting and better predict upcoming milestone delivery? This is kind of I would say, one of the key questions, especially in less mature agile shops, where they want everything delivered on time. So quite important topic. So we'll take a look into a few estimation techniques and their impact to the art and how we can use past performance to help inform our roadmaps. So for today, our speaker is Garth Howell, has been on the Agile road for many, many years, experiencing XP and Scrum firsthand as a developer before moving to SAFe organization and experiencing peer planning as Scrum Master and Release Train engineer. He's SAFe certified, so SPC, actively training groups in Caterpillar and launched a couple of Agile Release Trains for Caterpillar, undergoing underground mining last year, with more coming up for this year. So some good experience there from launching the trains and working as a RTE. So just before we begin, a couple of things. The presentation is being recorded, so take a note. It will be posted on YouTube. Please stay on mute during the presentation. If not discussing anything, you can ask questions during the presentation, and that's the best thing, as we are a small group. And there will be Q&A after the presentation, so feel free to post questions in the chat box. We'll address as many as possible at the end. Any other questions, guys, before we begin? Okay, if not, Garth, take it away.
All right, I'll share my screen. So this isn't an official slide deck or anything that I've done before, so I just put this together for today. So hopefully it goes through in a nice logical format, but if it doesn't, then we'll make the best of it.
Yep, we can see it. Excellent,
nice one. All right. Right, so very much like the summary that you just gave, Mihail. It's challenging sort of informing these roadmaps. And when you start to look, so this is from the SAFe guidance on sort of roadmaps, and they've got these different sort of plans that go from sort of your sort of iteration or sprint-based plans all the way up to your sort of multi-year forecasts, sort of showing you that you have normally more definition on the closer plans and less on the ones further out. Seems sensible. I think I see a lot of the sort of PI roadmap plans, which are that sort of just nearing on 1 year sort of boundaries, but then you often see those solution ones that go multi-year as well. And it's difficult to inform these sorts of plans. And businesses require this kind of horizon planning to work out their releases, their milestones, and you often have that sort of tension between sort of the pure agilists wanting to do everything just in time, and businesses wanting to do their planning, which is understandable on their horizon. So common challenge, like you said, and I'm sure we've all come across these kinds of challenges in our environments. So you've got your backlogs. They vary in their detail as well, and their levels of refinement. Typically, you have less detail in the sort of PI roadmap and solution portfolio roadmap horizons, like we saw before. Depending on the kind of work you have and the solutions you work on, you might have epics or capabilities, some kind of larger container of things. So, you might get away just with features, and that's fine. But there's often these sort of larger containers above that, and they're often what's represented on these roadmaps. If you don't, and you're working at the feature level, I think everything in this still probably applies, and probably the same challenges. Just each scale goes up, but it's all the same challenges. Sort of another word on that, actually, though, what is tricky with the backlogs is that you don't have too much definition. You have sort of some definition early on, hopefully, but then there's a varying amount of information you supply on these pieces of work before they come to the teams. And ideally they get to the teams fully refined, broken down, and they have good estimates on, but they quite often don't have that sort of level of detail up front. And so how do we inform roadmaps when we don't have that information? Obviously the old sort of waterfall approach of having that detail on the entire backlog, but we really can't do that, and we can't afford to do that in these large systems. So just a very simple version of sort of a workflow or a life cycle. I'm dealing with capabilities, but if that's your Epic or some other kind of container, then that's fine as well. So capability being sort of one above the feature at a sort of solution train level. But in this case, capability is just having one to many features underneath them. So a very simple sort of workflow going through of capability kind of needing some kind of business case, getting some kind of approval. It goes into a design phase, and then refinement starts at that point. I've got sort of those PI boundaries underneath, just to give an idea of generally these sort of business cases and designs are happening at that capability level a couple PIs before. Maybe it's PI -2 or something like that. And then sort of one PI ahead, we tend to try and break those down and get the features defined. And that's when you get a bit more detail, a bit more flesh on the bones. And then, obviously in the current PI, that's when you pick the work up and actually start working on them. So with my underground group, we started off with sort of story point estimates at various points in this flow. So for the first one was quite early. And the point, the reason for having a story point estimate really early on the capability at that design level, design state is to get these estimates on the work so that we could do horizon planning. So this is well before the teams are actually picking up the work. And so, that was a portfolio team. It consisted of sort of product management or solution management, architects, that sort of group. They decided to do this in story points. And it had limited input from the teams. So basically, part of sort of figuring out this work that was coming down the pipeline, it put story point estimates on it, and seemed pretty okay approach to do in the beginning. The next step further along was to have the teams when they were doing the breakdown of those features, so they actually get involved with the work at that point. They would put a story point estimate in as well. That was sort of a high level estimate. So the teams would pick up the work and very early on put some kind of estimate on there, so that they said, well, we think this is 13 story points or whatever it is. And then there would be a third level that went on as well. So after they were fully refined and had all the user stories defined, they then knew a bit more detail, and that story point estimate would get updated. So it wasn't really an additional one, it was more of an updating that initial estimate. And that would be right at your PI boundary. So hopefully by PI planning, you've got that kind of detail. And so that's what they were doing for a while, having these sort of 3 different points of estimating, and it was hopefully going to help them with their forward planning and horizon planning. But it did have a few problems to it right in the beginning. So those estimates, they were typically far smaller upfront. They were being done by a group that weren't doing the work, which obviously Agile and SAFe kind of does guide you down that path of rather having the people doing the work doing the estimates. The portfolio team, the architects and solution management, they're using different kinds of techniques. They have different ideas of what a 3-point means, different skill sets and experience. And so we had a bunch of problems. We were really underestimating, and it really didn't help too much with that horizon planning. We're getting things way out. And so, decision was made to involve the teams in that estimation up front, because clearly, we've got a disconnect between the portfolio team doing this estimation up early and what the teams are doing later on. So that seemed like the next logical step. But that actually made things kind of worse, because the team suddenly had a lot of context switching. They were now having to look at something 3 or 4 PIs ahead. get into that work. And now they're juggling that with the work they're already trying to prepare for the next PI, plus they're trying to do some work. So this was a complete mess, to be honest. Seemed logical in the beginning, but definitely created a lot of cognitive overload. And so that ended up getting ditched soon after. It was a good journey, though. So at that point, I switched them over to t-shirt sizing, which seemed like a very subtle difference. But I got the portfolio team to ignore story points for a bit and actually switched them over to t-shirt sizing. And so what we did there is said, don't worry about story points. There were a lot of conversations and arguments happening about what story points meant. So I switched them over to this sort of simple approach. We had basically from an extra small up to an extra large, so 5 or 6 different categories. The same team were doing this exercise and basically went through the backlog and started allocating a t-shirt sizing. So really try to get them to focus on being consistent and the relative estimating side of things. So it should really be the same idea as a story point, but I wanted to differentiate the 2 different pieces of the system. So, you know, this team were doing t-shirt sizing and the people doing the work were doing story points, just to stop those kind of conversations and arguments that were happening. So this was the first step in the process. Kind of left the teams doing their initial story point estimate again when they got to that first design phase. So this was just, you know, 1 PI ahead. They would break down their features and give a high level estimate, and that allowed us to sort of still do some sort of you know, near-term horizon planning at least. And again, the teams were doing their full story point breakdown as well as before when the work was ready. So this was the sort of first piece, but obviously, you know, what's good about this, the teams could focus on the next PI for preparation. They weren't doing the context switching, you know, their current PI obviously working on the delivery. There weren't these comparison problems, which I liked. There was a clear separation between the 2, but obviously it doesn't solve the problem of forecasting very well, because now you've got these t-shirt sizes, and so, well, what do I do with that? And you know, you can kind of get these sort of approaches of saying, well, we can do about 3 larges and 5 mediums in a PI, but it feels very very iffy and very wish-washy. So on its own, it wasn't really very useful. But what I had done is I had the Agile Release Train run this for a PI and gotten some data going in the background. So that was ultimately the plan. And so what I did next is I pulled the data out of our work management system and started to categorize all the work. So I took all of these capabilities, grouped them all into their various sizes. This is just an example of the extra small, small, and medium. And then actually looked at the real breakdown that had happened and the work that was involved. So looked at the story points and rolled them up, and then started to kind of chart them a bit. And they actually clustered really well. So when I pulled these up, I was pretty happy that apart from 3 outliers, they all seemed to kind of cluster pretty closely together, which meant that when that portfolio team were claiming something's an extra small, the dev teams actually broke it down to a fairly close sort of story point range, which was really good to see. This gave me some faith that this, at least with this group, this approach might work. And again, with the smalls, there was an interesting outlier and a couple with the mediums. And the outliers actually, to me, turned out as interesting conversation points as well. You know, why did those blow out? What was different about those? So there was some good value in that as well. What was interesting is, let me just wait for the screen to do its thing. Yeah, so what I did, I looked at the sizes, so the average sizes for each of those buckets. So I said, well, what is our average, you know, extra small? What's our average small? What's our average medium? I took out the outliers first. And then with the results, I mapped it back to the Fibonacci, and it actually fitted fairly well. I had the 8 and 13 and 21 that kind of matched pretty well for those 3 types. I didn't have any data for the largest, so we'd only worked on smalls and mediums and extra smalls. So I made an assumption here and kind of mapped the large onto something that seemed reasonable. And in hindsight, I should never have made this assumption. This was a bit of a mistake. Some larges were in the backlog and on their way through the pipeline. So I thought, oh, this will help us to look ahead. After the next PI, just for interest's sake, when I did actually get some real data, the larges that were in the backlog turned out a lot bigger than what I'd hoped. So that was an interesting one. But what was really, really good about this was as soon as I saw this, I could raise with the solution management group that those larges that we have lurking in our backlog are high risk and they are a problem. We need to look at them. We need to break them down. And I've advised the group to not have larges anymore. We need to break them down into mediums where possible, especially when they're getting a bit closer, and de-risk them. So it really highlighted that as soon as you got to a certain size, the system was complex, and the teams couldn't tell the difference between what was large and very large. It just became quite difficult to tell the difference. And it showed that there's a lot of risk lurking in there. And so again, what was great was looking at these roadmaps. I could kind of say, right, you've got that roadmap, but there were a few of these larges in there. We need to change things around a bit here because we've potentially got some risks. So that was a really good outcome from a bad outcome in a way. So seeing that those larges, and so my initial mapping for those larges, I guess, was obviously incorrect. But again, knowing that we need to try and break those larges down. So a couple other things from this that was good. Let me just wait for the screen to update. So yeah, as I said, the outliers.
Sorry,
yeah.
Very quickly, Sarah, please jump in. You were asking whether it's actual hours being tracked.
Oh yes, the top 3 charts. Was that, you must have been tracking your actual hours? Is that right?
No, this was actually still in story points. I would like to have done it in hours if we had access to the data, but we didn't have that. So it was actually just done with story points, and the teams had done a best effort of adjusting those story points at the end of the work. So there was sort of the concept of a forecast of the story points, and then after the work they would adjust it and map it to one they felt was more accurate. So it was I don't even know what to call it. It's definitely not an actual, but it's sort of something in between. So,
okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think if you had sort of hours or something a bit more concrete, it'd probably be better if you could. Yeah, and so the outliers were useful to kind of have a few retrospectives around those and dig into, well, why did this medium become large, or why did this small become a medium? Matt, you got your hand up?
Yeah. So just going back a bit, could you explain a bit more why this first round of estimation by the team is needed? How is it being used in planning? So it's a few PIs out, and they're it's just surprising that there's two, that we need these 3 rounds of estimation. Why do we need 3 instead of just 2? What's the benefit?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and I think not all. I'm imagining that some groups don't need 3. So the reason why I've got 3 with this group, so this first one, obviously at the capability level, is for that horizon planning. So that one's obviously looking further ahead, and something's needed at that point to be able to look ahead a couple of years and hopefully not involve the teams too much. So that's the purpose of that first one. If you're getting more, you might be asking more about this one. Why do we have this high-level estimate from the teams? And again, I think this is going to come down to sort of maturity of the group as well. So in the situation I have, there's a lot of work that comes through, and you start PI planning with a mixture of some features being fully refined and fully broken down. And then maybe that would probably account for 2 to 3 of my iterations, but the back 2 to 3 iterations of the PI won't be as refined. And so those features are quite often very descriptive, and they have information, but they don't have user stories underneath them. And so to get around that, the teams are required to put estimates on them to allow us to get better PI planning results. But in the cases where if you didn't need that, and you have all of your features refined, you know exactly how big things are, you probably don't need that at that point. But that's the reason I have it now. So basically PI planning starts, and it's a combination of so many features in a team, very well defined. Some of them are a little vague, but they can at least still do their sort of capacity planning and make sure that they have a plan they feel they can still commit to.
I see. Thanks. I guess I got confused when you were mentioning the context switching. I thought this planning was taking place even further out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for this.
Yeah, the context switching was really a problem when we started pulling the teams in very early on to try and get that horizon sort of view, and that's where the real context switching was a problem. At least leading up to PI planning, the teams were looking at that work, and it was on their radar, and they were involved in those discussions. But when we're looking at doing the sort of that horizon planning, and that solution group are putting together what if scenarios. They're looking at, if I bundle this stuff together and create a release in a year and a half, and they want to get that information, they want to do that projection. We don't want to involve the teams in those kinds of scenarios, because that would be, really way out of their view of what they're working on. And so that's where that became quite a problem. Got a hand up. Is it Raj?
Yes, Garth. Hi. Just like in terms of estimation, again, like always, there's a conversation between like velocity versus story points versus number of actual hours. So in my past, like we've been using the velocity, which was very easy for us to estimate, like and also in terms of and we had already defined on those velocities and what each means. But in my present, I've been as hired as an agile coach. That's one of the roles that I do. So what happens is, like, I've been advised to do the estimation in the number of hours, so that it reflects to the timesheets, and thereon, like, it goes like that. It's been very difficult, like, because each and every we are not able to benchmark, and we have to arrive at we have to do a number of hours estimation for each and every ticket by itself, and we don't have any relative estimation at this point. So like how do I, is that like anything that we could do, like still use number of hours, and then that's a pain I'm currently facing right now in my current role. Like, I want to move away from the hours and then like go back to the story points, but it's very hard to convince people.
I think that could be a whole discussion on its own. I think the whole hours, I think that comes up everywhere I've worked. You have a chain of management that want the hours, and you've got people that are happy with the story points, and it's a complicated one to do. I think I suppose if whether or not you can get rid of the hours thing completely is going to be a sort of political question, I suppose, of your environment as well. But you could make them work together, and I suppose you could take a similar approach to I've done here, where you could have sort of your either story point or t-shirt sizing, whatever it is, your relative estimating happening on one level, and you could do a mapping to hours the same way I've done a mapping to story points. So you could pull out, if you can get information from your last PI, pull out the hours and do the roll-ups. You could then map that to your relative estimating. So you could say, when someone says it's a 8-pointer or someone says it's a medium, it results in 100 hours. And so you could create that mapping the same way, and it might help you. So you can still do your forecasting in relative estimating, or maybe use relative estimating for your very quick high level up front, but then back it with the hours sort of underneath the hood. So I'd probably give something like that a go and do a similar thing I've done here, but map it from relative to the hours.
Okay, yeah, I can try that. And alongside, like there's always a debate, like, should we estimate the bugs and production issues that's been given to us? So like, what are your thoughts? Like, I've never estimated bugs, so we can't, like, we don't know what we are dealing with.
Yeah, there's another controversial topic, the estimating bugs, and I think there's different sort of thoughts on this. And for me personally, so the one train of thought is, well, you estimate features and you estimate user stories. The bugs come out in the wash of velocity. So velocity is, implying value delivered. And so if you take that pure agile approach, then you're looking at your velocity is delivering value to a customer, whereas I guess a bug could be thought of as not delivering value. For me personally, I found that if I don't have teams estimating bugs, then PI planning commitments get very difficult. I've personally found it very difficult to do. And I find then maybe if you're in I think maybe if the product's in a maintenance mode and it's not happening so much, but if you have a lot of bugs showing up and it's uneven amounts from PI to PI, personally, I think it's easier to estimate them and have that sort of, for the commitments. But some of the challenges with that, I've had the team say it's very difficult to estimate bugs as well. Not knowing how much, how much is in a ball of string kind of thing until they open it up and
Exactly.
stuff. And that's one of the challenges you have. So I think from a planning perspective, I prefer to have it, but some of the teams find it very difficult to put estimates on. What I've done before, again, it's a bit of a sort of statistical average, but I've had a look over 3 or 4 PIs and just done a bit of averaging and I came up with an average for my bugs were 5 points. After having sort of a few hundred in there. And that gave me a way to at least go, well, we can at least put some capacity aside. We know we need capacity for these 10 bugs. I can take on average 5 per bug. And so what I did in that case is I used story points on the bugs based on historical performance. The teams didn't need to estimate them because they were not comfortable estimating them, but it allowed me to kind of put some capacity aside and I solved that way. It's not perfect and it's not going to be accurate for 1 or 2 bugs, but over many bugs it comes out sort of in the wash and then it works all right. So I've done that one before.
Yep, no worries. Thanks for that. Thanks. That's all.
Tricky problem that though, and it might come down to the teams, right?
Yeah, it's a can of worms basically because it starts getting into capacity, gets into retro, and are you repeating the bugs and a lot of other bits and pieces that we can discuss. There was Andrew, you had something on the side. You want to discuss it now or maybe at the end?
Yeah, we can leave it to the end because
beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right. So just to sort of summarize that approach that I'm using with the teams, and it seems to be working pretty well. So we've got our art velocity, as an example, could be 300 story points. Depending on how your train's running, I've got a capacity split. So I'm doing about 60% business. There's the remainder there goes down to things like, either emergent work or there's a bit of bug fixing and there's some tech debt being burnt down as well. So knowing that I've got a 60% split that's been agreed with the business, with 300 story points, then I know more or less over that period. So when I'm doing that sort of horizon planning, I know if I'm looking at 3 PIs, I've got 900 times 0.6. That gives me an idea of the story points. The solution management group, they do a bit of what if scenarios with the backlog. They'll group a bunch of capabilities and say, oh, I want this in a potential release in a year's time, and use that sort of mapping. And I've automated this in ADO so that when they select things, we can automatically see what that story point estimate is, and then can kind of look at that burn down and see how long it'll take to get that sort of what if scenario played out, and will we be able to hit the sort of dates they're looking at. And so using that for actually mainly using it for that PI roadmap, so just sort of 1, 2, 3 PIs, maybe looking at about a year ahead for that. And what's really good is I basically supplied a dashboard and the backlog with prioritization in there, and they're able to self-serve that, which is really good. So they basically can just use a tag, apply that to everything they're interested in, refresh the dashboard, and it gives them an idea of sort of how much work's involved and when it might get finished. So that's been pretty good from a sort of self-serve perspective. What I'm having to do is just each PI, I'm rerunning those numbers just to see if it's shifting. The last couple of PIs, it's been pretty stable, which gives me a bit more faith that it's not just some numbers that have come out of a spreadsheet. It's sort of following pretty closely with those sort of mappings. So which is good. And of course, some of the larges came through, which changed it a little. So knowing that larges are now not following that initial estimate, so definitely need to get the teams to try and break those down early. So that was kind of useful. Obviously, that assumption made about the sizes was a mistake. So in hindsight, I shouldn't have done that. I should have rather just said we don't know what that is. But anyway, we learned from that one. So the size outliers, so one of the risks with doing an approach like this and not having the teams involved early is that the teams may have spotted something that this group do not, because they are the ones doing the work. And so we've introduced a risk here. And so to kind of mitigate that risk, I thought we need these checkpoints. So the one checkpoint being that when the teams do their initial estimate, if that's way out from that first estimate that got put in with the t-shirt size, if that's very different, that's a flag that we could say, right, well, we need to just stop for a second, just have a look. Maybe it's a misunderstanding in requirements. Maybe the team are thinking about something different. Let's just have that conversation and work out what's happening. It might be possible to just do some scope adjustments, make some changes and get back on track, or maybe we need to stick with the larger estimate, and again, we can then adjust our horizons, but at least we know early, which is great. So that's the one checkpoint that helps with that. Yeah, it's all about the sort of Goldilocks level of team involvement. So you're trading off a bit of improved estimation. So sure, if you've got the teams to do the full estimation, you probably get a better quality estimate, but then you start to increase that context switching, that cognitive load. So bit of a Goldilocks level, and it might be a little different for different groups, and trying to find just that right level that you can get good enough estimates to get these forecasts that keep that cognitive load for the teams down a little bit. Yeah, those outliers did turn out to be good conversation topics, though, a bit of problem solving around them, which was handy, and some good things came out of that. That solution management group, they're able to forecast. They're definitely a lot more accurate and a lot more reliable than the initial starting point, where they were just putting their own story points on things. So far working really well. I think we're on PI 3 now, and everything seems to be humming along quite nicely in that department. So far that's been working pretty well. But obviously, like I think Matt, you pointed out, whether you need all of this will depend on your scenario. So this was for the specific environment, we needed something like this for that horizon planning. So I think that's it. That's all I wanted to go through. If there are any other questions, happy to.
Perfect. Thank you, Garth. Actually, tons of questions. I'll go with probably Andrew. Go with yours first.
Yeah, thank you. And my question was in the chat window. It's just doing all that upfront sizing at the capability level. Did that lead to your management having still the traditional and value type management approach and view, then you're tracking against percentage complete and resulting in some kind of lack of flexibility?
So I guess the trade-off you've got is without any kind of estimate up front, I don't know how you can do any kind of horizon planning. So that's a tricky problem.
That was my question basically when I saw the story points being assigned to the capability. So that's where my question was coming from. Then you changed your approach a little bit.
Yeah, and the story points up front were, I think it was the natural instinct of the group to say, we need story points at this point, so let's put it in without thinking about the impact and what it means. And it did open a can of worms by having those story points. It created all sorts of arguments, and it also ended up with sort of management looking too closely at story points, which you don't want either. And that behavior kicked in as soon as they had story points up at that level, because it became noticeable and became a conversation. So that's one of the reasons I switched to something else. I wanted to change the conversation. So part of the reason for changing to a different type of estimation was to try and change that narrative a little as well. So there was a bit of a political reason behind it. But absolutely, I agree. Opening a bit of a can of worms with the story points early on.
Yeah, and I guess the other part to that was, and I've seen this with trains I've launched, and I've gone back maybe 12 months later, and I've seen that they're going back to the normalization formula of the 8 points per person per sprint. Are your teams doing that, or are they relying on velocity, past velocity?
No, definitely using past velocity. Look, that is a method that SAFe has. If I guess you have a brand new team, I think I always encourage, if at all possible, don't use that. You only use it as a last resort. I mean, if you find yourself in PI planning and the team's just been assembled, go for it. It's a starting point, but I don't want to see that past PI1, right? It's got to be gone. So.
Exactly. I've just seen that they always go back and they've got a spreadsheet that they use, and trying to coach them to move away from that and look at the
It's amazing, right? And also they fall back to that conversion of 3 days is a point, and we really struggle with the concept of relative estimating. We like to think about days, and I find the teams, even when they're using story points, are still thinking of days and doing a conversion in their head. It's I've tried to with a couple of teams, I've tried to print out some very good examples. I always say to them, give me a very good example of what you think a small piece of work is in this team. And we find that example printed out. Back in the days we had an office, printed it out and put it on the wall, and said, right, well then let's find one that's bigger than that and bigger than that. And we actually built up sort of your Fibonacci sequence in terms of actual things as opposed to numbers. And so when you're in the room, you could say, well, is it bigger than that one, or is it less complex than that one? And it gave us something to do relative sizing with, and it helped, I think, having a concrete example as opposed to just a number. It takes a bit of maturity for a team to be able to just work with the numbers, right?
Yeah, I've seen that myself, and especially with even in the courses are run, the bottom line says never look back, and people always look back to it. So yeah, I'm keen to hear.
Yeah,
maybe it's another discussion, but thank you for answering the question.
Yeah. I should probably check the chat. I haven't been very good at watching the chat.
Nothing in the chat, but I can throw another question while someone else is preparing.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi,
Kristen.
Garth. How are you? Great presentation. I was wondering, you talked before about, which I thought was really clever, using different ways, different sort of levers to change the conversation. Are there other ways what are other ways that you've done that? Changing the nature of the conversation where it's less command and control and more about empowerment of people on the ground?
Wow, that's quite a question. But yeah, so the story point estimate, the t-shirt sizing felt like a good way to do that, because we had ended up in that classic argument over story points, and the teams had gotten really upset that it was leaking out into reports and all sorts of things as they do, which is fair enough. So that was part of the technique there, was to change that narrative. So that was the purpose of it. Are you wondering what a different way to solve that problem, or just a different example of?
I just love the way that you meet them where they're at, as far as I guess examples. We're talking about sizing and different language and syntax that we can use to, I guess, lower barriers and change the nature of that conversation. Are there any other tricks that you've used as far as reducing the command and control and empowering people on the ground?
I'm going to have a think about that one, Christy. That's
no worries.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I guess that behavioral change. That's all good. That was full of gold, your presentation, so I got lots out of it.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. That's a interesting topic on its own, I think, is how to do that carefully, right? And,
I think you did well, like it with integrity and that gentle behavioral change, just by changing the name of something. It's actually quite smart, but really simple.
What I also liked about t-shirt sizing is it stopped that sort of numbers getting added and things. It kind of stopped all of that behavior, because you don't really try and add a small to a large and all of that. It just kind of, you leave it as what it is. It's just a size. Don't try to do more with it. So it kept things very simple at that level. And then all of the under the hood did the other bits that I needed it to do.
Really clever. I guess less confrontational for them too, or not as much change when we're taking care of, I guess, under the hood.
Raj, you got your hand up?
Sorry, there was a question. I think Mihaly was before me. Like, you had some question, I can go after you.
Mine are more kind of very straightforward. How much training did they receive before they started at the beginning? Because some of the things like story points, estimation of the capability level, they would, if someone received training, they would know. Kind of thing. So was there any training before you started, or was it all experiential?
It was experiential, the story points, and I think there were a few. This has been a sort of long-lived group, even though they haven't been on SAFe for very long. And so a number of the folks that were estimating in that portfolio group had been on the teams a long time before, which is good in terms of their experience, but it meant that they still had that same idea of I story point my work. And so they just took that through naturally. And so I think that's partly why they just carried on doing what they'd always been doing. Which could have been fine, but their ideas of sizes were very different to what the teams were doing, which caused a lot of the problems. But yes, there wasn't any training at that point. It was only when we changed to the t-shirt sizing approach that actually pressed pause and spoke about things properly and had a bit of discussions around it. Whereas up till then it was sort of an organic change that had happened, and it was really just trying to plug the holes as they burst, as opposed to any kind of formal training.
Yeah, as Christy mentioned, it's a behavioral thing. You kind of get into learning cycle, and then you haven't, because then they want to learn more.
Yeah.
And then it's easy after that, rather than shove down, okay, you do it this way, kind of thing.
Yeah.
One more, sorry, Raj, just to, you mentioned that you were doing capabilities as well. Were you doing a value stream, the level above arts, so art of arts kind of thing?
Yes. So I'm doing a bit of portfolio level with large solutions. So there's a few large solutions in Caterpillar. Yeah, absolutely. So that's where the capability kind of came in. But it should sort of be a similar approach. I think if it's an epic or something else that you're doing, it should have the same kind of impact, I guess. Large solution.
Those capabilities get broken down into feature across a number of trains, right? You have many-to-many mapping, right?
Yes, yeah. So in this case, there are I think there's three groups, and it's a bit complicated because they're not all Agile Release Trains yet. So
that's okay.
There's sort of one dependent Agile Release Train that falls into that solution, but there's also a couple groups that are hopefully coming along soon. But there's another complication, which is a whole nother conversation, which is around hardware teams. So we've got hardware teams that do not want to play ball with Agile, let alone SAFe. And so that's one of the conflict points that we have at the moment, is how do we tie in a hardware group that are very much spec-based and very much waterfall, and it could be that that's the best mode for them. I'm not familiar enough with the work they do to know if Agile would even be better for them. But how do we?
Correct. You might have a
need
just to do a milestone check-in at some point, but define that, invite them to the PI planning so they know at what point. I mean, they can tell you basically on their call it Gantt chart at what point they'll have what, and then deliver.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and so that's the approach, is to try and get sort of these integration points and PI planning linked up, and try and get a bit of cadence linked up, but ultimately not trying to move them over to any kind of real Agile delivery, leaving them on their engineering process, but trying to just plug into the rest of the important pieces that we need to link it all together.
You just answered my third question, which was, what's your next challenge? That's your next challenge. Thanks. Raj, all yours.
Yeah, that's a big one that might take a while. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, mine might be like a bit of a lengthy question. Like my previous question, like I was modest to express my concern, like as an agile coach, between the disagreement between myself and the management in terms of the estimation. But see, like I've been like working in established organizations where they had mature agile practices, and like that way it was totally different. It was very easy for me to make people understand like what's the benefit that's coming out of it when we implement this. And like all I have to do this is people like follow those disciplines, and then like we see the results. And right now, like I've moved into a new capacity where like I have been hired as an agile coach and also an engineering leader. I'm wearing two hats in here. So where that organization is very new to agile, and they have been like they have been just doing like as of like they have been acting very reactive to all the work, and they can't achieve anything. So we have prepared a roadmap and for year 2025, financially 2025, and I had a look at it like for the last 3 weeks. Like I've been telling them that like the roadmap doesn't have enough details. We just like left with 3 weeks by now to start next financial year. And for at least for Q1, we don't have any items scoped or even detailed discussion hasn't happened. So people believe that like we can start working on it, and we are very busy. We should look at what we are looking at right now. And like once we pick up things, then like we'll have more details and we can start going on it, which is not the right thing to do. So that is like when you've been hired as an agile coach, isn't like the person's responsibility to make people like aware of the risk of like not doing adequate planning, and like what will be the outcome of it. So how do you handle this situation?
Yeah, I think you've got a difficult situation there to handle. And I think when you, like you said, you come into a group that have that maturity and understand the value, then you can have a conversation and pivot and introduce something. And it's very difficult. What you're trying to do is you're trying to change the way they work, and also show them the value in why you're doing that. So it is difficult. And I think the last group I had similar to that, I found I had to start at the real foundation part of it, and I kind of went for visibility first. So with that group, I just wanted to show them what they were working on, because they didn't actually have a good picture of what they were working on. So I started with that. I got them to categorize the work that was coming in, because there was a lot of firefighting happening with this group. So I took an approach of getting them to spend a PI categorizing all this work that was coming up. And so at the end of the PI, I actually showed them a breakdown, and I said, look, 60% of the work you've done was firefighting. They've never looked at it, never added it up. They just know that they're constantly doing things. And when they actually saw that, and I said to them, the next PI, you can only book in 40% of work, because you keep booking in 80%, but you've got all of this unplanned stuff that comes up. And I could show them, went back historically. And so for a couple of PIs, we just planned at 40% and actually then started to deal with the rest of the work. And so I think kind of taking them on a bit of a journey and trying to look for small wins where possible, and bring them along slowly. It's very difficult to introduce a big change to a group that don't know any of that. So I sort of took the approach of trying to do some foundational little small things, get them on board with a few wins, show them the way slowly, and then you gain a bit of trust. You can start doing a bit more. But you've also got a problem with your sort of product backlog not being in a good state either, and that's tricky as well. So that's sort of that definition of ready sort of thing. But again, you can't just introduce that with a group that don't know what that is and the value of it. They're just going to see it as more admin. So again, tricky to do. So you might need to try and bite off some small pieces there. Maybe try and introduce just a little bit of sort of, we need these things in place before we get to PI planning, at least as a minimum. So what I did with this group, they had a bit of that problem. They were also going into some development without the right details. So I created sort of a dashboard, which was a PI readiness dashboard, and I just shared it every opportunity I could. And I kept showing to them, we need 300 story points in this state. At the moment, we have 50. And I said, PI planning's in 4 weeks. And I would just keep showing this dashboard and showing them the progress up to that point. And that kind of helped a little, I think, again, the visibility, and just kind of reinforcing that the teams need this. The teams need these things in this place, and to have them ready. And so, having that kind of helped a little bit, but I don't think any of it's really a sort of magic pill for the problem. But I think, little wins and keep at it, right? But it's difficult. You're fighting a tough battle there, and try and find some other champions around you. Try not to do it all yourself. You need to find other people to share the journey with and get excited and help with this. Otherwise, if you're on your own, it's sort of a tide against you. You're not going to win.
Yeah. Sometimes it might be demotivating when you don't see the results. Like that I can experience it sometime. So and like as a follow-up of that question, like I have worked in SAFe, and I also worked in like the traditional Scrum methodology. So this is which one, like where do we want to? Is there any recommendation that like SAFe is appropriate, like or versus traditional Scrum, which like sometimes it might be overkill.
So just remember, at the team level, SAFe is Scrum. There's almost no difference. There's very, very little difference. There's a couple little naming differences, but otherwise, when you're talking team level, it very much, they've adopted Scrum and said just do Scrum. There is also a Kanban style team that you can do as well. So SAFe is scaled Scrum. So the only other comparison would be there's sort of less is one of the other options, and there's a few other scaled agile approaches that you can use. I think if you're looking for something lighter than SAFe, I believe less. I haven't personally done it, but less is supposed to be the sort of lighter approach to scaling Scrum. And I think there's a couple other frameworks as well. So you could look into that. It might help. I know that there's a lot of people that are anti sort of the heavy-handed approach that might be in SAFe. They seem to like the less approach, LESS. They seem to like that approach. It's a little lighter touch.
Okay.
But yeah, Scrum on its own doesn't solve the scaling problem. It's not really built for enterprise. It's built for teams, and so it's great at that level. But the problem SAFe's trying to solve is really that higher level, the scaled problem.
Yep. Sure. Thanks, Garth.
Yeah, Raj, I've just pasted state of agile. It's basically a recurring yearly kind of check, and you can see there which scaling methodologies are basically and how much they're used. Just FYI, if you haven't seen that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, got it. Thanks, Megali. I'll have a look at it.
Yeah, and they're really good tools to have in your toolbox, I suppose. And depending on the organization and what they're trying to accomplish, could be better to use one or the other.
Okay.
Matt, you got your hand up?
Just because you brought up Kanban, I was wondering if you were doing that at the portfolio level, then does some of this need to do this estimation go away? Because you get the predictability if you just ensure that, maybe every epic and capability can roughly fit inside a PI, it's about the right size. And then these sorts of estimates are less necessary. I don't know how familiar you are with Kanban.
Yeah, so obviously the teams that I've worked with on sort of Kanban usually have some kind of hybrid. They often have a little bit of planned work and otherwise they have some sort of service-based work and then sort of it's more about sort of allocating that capacity. So coming back to that point I had, it was actually one of those hybrid teams that I was working with where it was so important to categorize the work so that they understood how much was sort of emergent and how much of it was planned and firefighting, so that they could do that Kanban approach effectively and know that they only need to reserve so much capacity for their planned work. Up at the portfolio level, I haven't done that at sort of at a scaled level. I think it could work depending on the work that you have. It might work if you know that your train can handle sort of 20 features on average, provided they're within a certain range or certain size. Then, especially it depends on the distribution. If you know that the work coming through, you have a few larges, a few smalls, but everything's mostly a medium. And if you have enough of those features coming through your workflow, then maybe you could say on average, as long as we have 20 features, it'll make it through, and that's all right. And then you could use that as a bit of a horizon planning. The environment I'm in, the work is quite complex and quite different to each other, and I think using that approach would be problematic, but I think in some environments it might be absolutely good enough and get you close enough.
I had a question. I was just wondering, when you were showing the readiness dashboard, you said you wanted to show it many times. There's only 50 stories that had enough detail in them. Were you showing that? Who were you showing that to? Were you showing that to people outside of the team, or was it product people inside the team that needed to do the work?
It was actually a combination. It was sort of not so much the product owners, but more that product management group that were new to it and were used to firefighting and doing things sort of last minute. So it was really sort of business owner, product manager, sort of at that sort of feature level, but then also above that at the solution level. So it was the group that was feeding information into the Agile Release Train as well. So it was sort of almost that border of as work comes into the train, and then at that top level, the teams were asking for it. They actually wanted to have that clarity. So the product owners within the teams were asking for that information. But yeah, it was more than one sort of person, but it was, and I'd say it was a symptom of the sort of maturity of that product management group that just weren't used to kind of having that information ready and permanently sort of just doing things last minute and firefighting. They just weren't quite in that space of looking ahead to the right level and the right depth.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I had a team that were really struggling with that, and I was doing the same thing, showing a dashboard as many times as I could to as many people as I could, saying, look, we haven't got enough.
Yeah.
But also trying to get, there were some team members who needed to take some ownership for getting some of the detail or working with the product team to get the detail with the product managers. So it was quite a battle. They were like, just tell us what to do. Just give us the, just give us the requirements.
Yeah, isn't that interesting, right? It's sort of one group wanting to be spoon-fed everything and putting your hands up saying, we can't do it, we don't have the information.
Yeah.
And so I do like that SAFe draws a circle around product management, and the product owners are part of that group. And so they don't actually call it a product manager. They say it's product management, and it's this role that's it's a function really. And so it's all of their responsibility together. They need to be part of that. So like you said, the product owners at the team level need to be supporting and providing information and answering things just as much and being involved. So yeah, it's really important. Mihail, you got your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick one, because we're getting close to the hour, so I'm unsure if everyone has a bit more time for more questions. But exactly on this slide, you have a very standard problem with business. You say 60% of business, and on the right-hand side, you have just below the picture, committed and forecast. How comfortable was business that you wouldn't commit past the PI? That it was just a roadmap, just a forecast?
Yeah, I found that is a very difficult one, and they're still not comfortable with this. And I think it comes from Caterpillar's very much got a strong construction and engineering background, and they want commitment at all levels, and they want the commitment at the roadmap levels. And then you have someone like an agile coach or an SBC telling them we don't commit beyond 12 weeks, and it becomes a fight instantly because you have these two viewpoints colliding. I think in that case, the coach and SBC in that case were probably being a bit too strict as well, and needed to explain a bit more about what we mean by commitment. It's we can absolutely try and hit milestones and do our best to reach them, but what does a commitment mean in SAFe and that horizon? So there's a lot of coaching and education that comes along with that, and I'd say that the groups in Caterpillar I'm working with are still not there. And I guess you could argue, should they ever be that comfortable with that lack of commitment at that further level? I mean, they're funding things, it's their money, and I suppose there's an argument that they want commitment further out. So, it's an interesting problem, and I don't actually know how to deal with that at the moment. I'm trying to be diplomatic about it, and I'm trying to do these kinds of systems to support it so that we can get maybe not a commitment, but we can get closer to something that everyone's comfortable with. So it's part of the driving force behind why I did this. But it's a tricky solution, that one.
Yeah, there's absolutely, as you mentioned, there's never a right solution for it, and some rather evolving something with that people are comfortable with. So it's a good one, good approach. Yep. Yeah,
trying to find that happy medium where I think the two groups will never quite meet, and maybe it's okay to have that tension. The business should always want more, and we should always be looking after burnout, and there's a bit of healthy tension. And I think if you can get it to that healthy tension point and not a bad sort of argument, then I think you're winning. So maybe not trying to solve the problem, but trying to just make it work in a bit of harmony there.
Fantastic. I think also Raj had one regarding AI, and Matt said some ideas regarding.
Yes, so like I've just went through a training in PMI to see that like how Agile AI could assist like in making decisions in Agile, and also like last week like I attended a session like of Copilot session from Microsoft and Telstra partnership. So they also like brought a lot of they say like how Copilot could assist you in various like Microsoft suites. And in addition to that, like I've been started using like AI in Jira. So which now like I'm not writing queries, I'm asking questions like from my backlog to the Jira. So is there anyone using like any add-ons? So like trusted add-ons that can I purchase and use like along with my for this?
Just to introduce Matt, he comes from strong AI background.
Excellent.
Matt, what are your thoughts?
I like your question, Matt. I like your
Or
answer,
mute.
I should say. Yeah, it's not trained in
Yeah, because I
organization.
thought you were more focused on, like, I was thinking back to your earlier question about, oh, should I use less or SAFe or, and I think that really depends so much on your organization, right? Your context. What's going to
Yes.
work? You just have to experiment, right? Just
Yeah,
have a
definitely.
hypothesis. If I make this change and
Yep.
what's going to happen, here's how I'll measure it, and
And
inspect
be
and adapt.
comfortable with getting it wrong and trying again. But on the AI topic, that's a fascinating one, right? Because I feel like with the estimation, I'd love to have a few new fields in there where you maybe put a little bit more detail on your work items and get AI to start coming up with some of these t-shirt sizes or these estimates, and I'd love to give that a go. For me in my current environment, I'd need to do a on-prem one. Caterpillar's extremely scared of anything where the data leaves the premises. So looking at some internal groups doing some maybe local large language models or something like that, and having a look into that. It sounds like Jira is a lot further along, as always, than Azure DevOps. I think with Azure DevOps, you probably need to do a bit of an export and train a model and start playing around that way. But I love the idea of asking questions to your backlog. I think that's great, because what I really wanted was I'd like the validation crew to be able to check if something exists when a new bug gets created, because the duplicates are a pain. Just people trying to find if it's a duplicate of an old ticket and link them, and you end up with all these extra versions. I'd love AI to just be able to tell you, you've come across that 3 years ago, here's some candidates, that kind of thing. So that sounds really, really useful.
Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions, guys? Okay, if not, I'd like to close the discussion. And Garth, very, very much thank you for this. I think it was valuable for you as much as for us. We'll try to put this on YouTube as soon as possible. And hopefully, guys, this will kind of give you a bit of courage to say, hey, actually, I have something to say about this or contribute to a discussion. So as you saw, not rocket science. It's basically just presenting what you have done, and the rest of us basically get a lot of ideas from this. And God, there was some fantastic gems in there. So thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Garth.
Great to have conversations. That's the best part of this, and meeting other folks in the in the industry. It's great. So thanks very much. Hope to see you again.
Sure.
And
Thanks,
thank you
guys.
all of you guys for attending. Until next time.
Thanks, Mihail.
Yep.
Thanks, Garth.
See ya.
Yeah, thanks
care,
for
guys.
organizing, Mihail.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Garth.
Bye.
Pleasure. Ciao.